Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 2's lecture on personal factors affecting sport performance. Today we're looking at attempts by the industry leaders and researchers to understand psychological factors that can explain or even predict behavior of high-quality elite-level athletes. We have to be very careful of this sometimes because research has not shown that we can make a claim about predicting someone's future sport performance. Initially, back in the early 70s, Dr. Arnold J. Mandel, who was a psychiatrist who worked with the San Diego Chargers football team, basically tried to describe the personality profile of the players on the team. And he tried to say that separate player personalities were unique to the position that they played. In other words, that the quarterbacks all had the same personality profile, and then the running backs and that the tight ends all had different personality profiles. His research was actually not supported, but again, we have to be very careful because sometimes the image or the idea of sports psychology as something that's reputable can be questioned if individuals do try to make claims about predicting future performance. So an objective of this chapter is to examine personality testing and the use of research to determine if elite and non-elite athletes have different psychological characteristics. So we're going to start with an overview of sport personality. We are going to start by an overview of looking at sports personality. And according to your textbook, the definition is a person's distinctive and enduring thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that characterize the person's reactions to life situations. So we can assess this by looking at inventories, at questionnaires, or maybe comparing it to a scale or a certain profile. And a person's personalities consist of many traits. A personality trait is much more narrow in scope than someone's styles or characteristics. And I do want to point out, because your book goes on to talk about separating traits from orientations and styles and behavior tendencies, but I want to focus on personality and traits and the pros and cons of personality testing before we actually jump into talking about behavioral tendencies. So I want to take an opportunity to really identify what a trait is. And a trait is something that's permanent, it's enduring, it's stable qualities of a person that reflect what is referred to as someone's psychological core. So it's determined typically by 6 years old of age. Some of it is partially determined genetically. And some examples, if you're wondering, kind of still don't understand quite what a personality trait is, can be something that would cause someone to be clinically depressed, having trait anxiety or neuroticism, or being very type A in your organizational skills, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, where you maybe suffer from trait anger or risk-taking. I want to stress that personality traits are extremely difficult to change. Your textbook even refers to it as traits that are permanent, enduring, and not susceptible to change. So you do need to be aware of that. And personality traits also emphasize personal characteristics to explain behavior, not behavior itself. The goal of studying personality in sport, there's actually several of them, and just a couple of them are identified for you here. So the first one is to really identify an athlete's traits, to help identify the degree to which the athlete has those or possesses each trait, and to try and predict how the athlete will perform or to explain their current behavior. We have to be very careful about saying that a personality assessment will predict how an athlete will perform. There's very little research to back that up. But if an athlete, let's say, has a poor match or a poor game, maybe there's something within their traits that can explain the current behavior and can guide either a sports psychologist or a coach decision or method of handling that poor performance to see an improved performance the next time around. So if we were to get specific in regards to the goals of personality research for elite level athletes, here are some goals and reasons as to why we would want to look into their types of personalities and traits. So the first is to identify certain traits as being consistently and markedly different between athlete versus non-athlete. We also want to separate personality traits from related characteristics such as styles and orientations and behavior tendencies. And again, we'll discuss that in just a moment. We also look to determine if participation in competitive sports influences and modifies a competitor's personality structure. Is someone that's been typically been characterized as a follower all of a sudden does really well in a sport and all of a sudden steps up and starts to become a leader? Another goal is to make clinical diagnosis or to possibly explain an athlete's thoughts, emotions, or behavioral tendencies. We also want to determine if athletes with certain personality types gravitate towards certain kinds of sports. Oh, let me get rid of that. That's lovely. Or whether certain personality traits appear consistently in athletes with specific sports. That's an interesting concept. Think about anybody that you've ever known that plays soccer. Do their traits seem to be unique specifically to soccer players versus traits that you would see within endurance athletes that are cyclists per se? Another goal is to identify or predict an athlete's future potential to compete in a sport at advanced levels, and this is called talent identification. And again, initial attempts at assessing the personality of athletes resulting in promising or promises of finding an ideal athlete can be very, very dangerous. So we want coaches to stay away from strictly using personality tests to say, this is the perfect athlete for me, this is the only reason I'm going to recruit them. But again, you can see the final bullet point on the slide. It's very important that you understand that traits are different from behavioral tendencies and orientation styles, and we'll get into that in just a minute. So, right now, actually, let's do that right now. So let's talk about behavioral tendencies. These are defined as someone's actions, whether they're planned or unplanned, which are consistent and predictable across certain situations. They also reflect an athlete's routines. So remember, routines are their thoughts and behaviors that someone automatically integrates into his or her day. And specifically, we're talking about athletes, so during their sport competition. Routines also help athletes maintain emotional control and regulate physical and mental energy before and during the event. If you haven't read the section on page 22 within your textbook regarding behavioral tendencies, it's actually a pretty interesting read. And I'll just kind of summarize a little bit of it here for you. But psychology researchers have studied the behavioral patterns of elite athletes, and they've noted several consistencies or several tendencies following pre-event and event behavioral tendencies. And there's actually 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, almost approximately 25 tendencies that they have listed for you that are common with an elite athletes, to the tune of putting less effort and intensity into practice in the actual competitive event. When it comes to physical training, the elite athletes go all out, they get into top shape, and they maintain it during the off season. Elite athletes prefer to play their own contest and to regulate their own effort levels. They use information gained from each contest, and then they apply that even as far as what happened with the spectators and how to make themselves better for the next time around. So the behavioral tendencies, the important part to understand is that a person's capacity to perform motor skills can be genetically fixed. Remember, we talked about how our capabilities are pretty much predetermined by the genetic lottery and the parents that we're born to. But what actually separates the elite athletes from those who are less successful is the willingness to make mental and physical efforts to actually reach that capacity. And one of the ways that they do this is through those routines that you see here. Psychological characteristics that your textbook talks about describes the athlete's typical thoughts or emotions or attitudes in specific types of situations, whether they're in training, whether they are actually in the match situation itself, or whether they're doing some sort of recovery yoga class after, let's say, they win the Super Bowl or something of that nature. So examples of psychological characteristics could be state anxiety. If they're very, very heightened and aroused right before competition or pre-competition. Resilience to stressful situations. Elite athletes typically are very resilient in handling those situations because sometimes their careers, sometimes their salaries, or even their families depend on their performance. So now we're going to come back and talk about disposition styles and orientations. I know I've skipped a little bit ahead, but now I want you to go back a little bit to the beginning and the real importance is to understand the difference between dispositions or styles or orientations versus traits. So if you remember, traits are something that are enduring. They're very, very difficult to change. Orientations or styles or dispositions are something that kind of reflect a person's preference or a tendency to think or act in a predictable manner. So what you have to understand is these are not fixed traits. Styles, orientations, dispositions can be changed with training given certain situational characteristics. So that's the big difference. Traits are typically set. Dispositions are something that can be changed with training. So for example, optimism versus pessimism. Are you someone that continuously sees the glass half full, or do you see it as half empty? Typically with training, you can change your ideas to be more optimistic if that's what you need. Competitiveness, goal orientation, win orientation, coping style is a great example of disposition or styles. How does an athlete deal, or how do they choose to deal with a loss? Are they going to view it as a learning experience where they remember that pain, they remember that horrible gut feeling from losing when they shouldn't have, and take that information and use it to fuel their practices in order to really improve their performance next time? So once again, the big difference that I want you to understand between traits and dispositions is that traits tends to be something that's enduring, very, very difficult to change, versus dispositions and styles and orientations that can change with appropriate training. So why would we research personalities according to elite level athletes? There's pros and cons about doing this type of research. So the in favor ideas of doing sports personality research are a couple different reasons. Number one, it gives us data. It helps us understand sports traits that might be necessary to be an elite level athlete. It also gives us information about player selection, maybe positioning, and also the psychological needs with talent identification. It also allows us to see individuals have very strong scores and how we can help further develop those skills that would maybe explain those scores. And then also, research findings do indicate that there are unique qualities of elite level athletes, and we'll talk about those again in a little bit. Here they are. Common characteristics of elite level athletes. Self-motivation. Intrinsic motivation. They have an internal drive. They have goals that they've set. They're very self-determined. They are dominant. They are very aggressive. They have attributional bias tendencies sometimes. They take credit for success but maybe blame failure on external factors. So these aren't always the best traits to have, but research has shown that these typically are the common characteristics associated with elite level athletes. And I think it's interesting too that down here they have fear of failure. Fear can be a great motivational tool. And especially, again, if you're talking about athletes that are professional and their family and their fortune is, or even just their daily living expenses depend on their performance, fear can be a very good tool. So the next couple slides talk about the case against personality research, how it can be more harmful than really helpful. And the first thing has to do with methods and measurement problems. There really truly is no sound theoretical framework to personality research. There's different tests out there. And I'm looking in your book, there was a list and I can't find them now. I'll find them in a second. Different types of personality tests that are out there that are all they're not standardized. So what one personality test might say you have certain traits, a different personality might associate you with different traits. So that causes confusion with measurement tools and the different models of personality psychology. Sometimes also the expectations are too high. They're very unrealistic, especially if we're talking about talent identification with athletes. Another case against personality research is that someone's changing environment can affect their performance. If you think physiologically about that, think about an athlete training below sea level or at sea level and then all of a sudden going to play at Mile High Stadium that's located in the Rockies. You train... what was that? How did we say it? Train high, live low, train high. Train high, live low. Of course, physiologically, if you've got a decreased capacity to carry oxygen around your body, that environment is going to affect the performance. Also, there are specific needs of different sports types that have to be considered when taking into consideration someone's sport personality. And then also, prediction can remove the benefits of developing sport skills and coaching. We don't want to peg anybody in too early to, well, this is what your personality trait test said about you, so we're going to make sure that you only play baseball and you're only going to be a catcher. So that's kind of some of the drawbacks against doing personality research. Another concept is the chicken versus the egg, which came first. Do desirable personality skills come before, or do they come after sports participation? Do sports change, and do they improve personality in an individual? Or are individuals with certain personality traits more likely to be attracted to sports? Interesting concept there. Other cases against personality research talk about the findings concerning sports performance prediction. They're very inconsistent. There's also high relationships that exist between athletic ability and personality. Also, self-selection. Youth athletes that don't possess certain traits tend to drop out and are weeded out by coach selection process. So is that a positive? Is that working towards the ACSM guidelines to get everybody physically active over the course of their lifetime? There's also something called selection bias. If you study adults, those taking the tests are likely that they possess the traits considered desirable. Another concern is about trait theory. And trait theory talks about how many different broad dispositions are used to explain behavior in different situations, and what this causes is low prediction rates in athletes that might be appropriate for certain positions or sports, or they just might get inaccurately described, for lack of a better term. So what we have to understand in regards to trait theory is that situational factors have to be considered when making interpretations in behavioral studies. And then another final case about personality research talks about that traits exist, but they may not always be useful in explaining behavior in sport. So here are some sample situational factors that can influence the evidence or presence of traits. So when we talk about presence of acute stress, remember acute meaning short term. Is it something that happens quickly? A game is sprung on them. How quickly and how appropriately do they handle that situation, and then can they let it go after the match? Do they have effective or ineffective coping strategies? Are they in a competitive situation versus a practice condition? Sometimes, unfortunately, we've got athletes that don't practice how they play, or play how they practice, because of that idea that if whatever you do in practice, that's what's going to transfer over into the game. Sports versus off the field, level of pressure and expectations, the presence and the type of an audience can really influence how individuals react, and evidence of traits. And then past experiences come into play as well. So rather than being concerned about predicting success based off personality measures, we should really examine personal satisfaction in the sport. Are they satisfied? Do they enjoy it? Their perceived competence. Do they have skill mastery? If so, they're probably going to feel like they're pretty good at what they do. Risk-taking or stimulus-seeking behaviors. Attributional style, mental toughness, and competitive trait versus state anxiety. Other alternative dispositions that coaches, trainers, parents, even athletes themselves need to be aware of is motivation, and the fact of higher in need of achievement and less of an let me back up. They have higher in need achievement. In other words, most elite level athletes have that internal drive to want to reach their goals and to be successful. Coaches also need to be aware of the level of intrinsic motivation. If there's a lack of intrinsic, maybe there's more extrinsic motivation. That's definitely something to be aware of, because it's going to affect maybe how you're going to coach that specific athlete. Understand someone's sport confidence. Again, if we talk about skill mastery, that is the base, that is the foundation of the pyramid in order to build up to sport confidence. So do they have that skill mastery that would lead them to sport confidence or not? We also want to be aware of their mood state, be aware of their pain threshold or tolerance for being uncomfortable in a situation, maybe in a hard tackle, and also look at their competitiveness. So we're going to skip forward a little bit ahead in the chapter and talk about the audience effects on athletes' performance. So skill level often separates how an athlete will respond to the presence of spectators in the audience. High quality athletes react to the presence of an audience differently than lower skilled competitors. The main reason for the different reaction is that higher skilled athletes become more excited cognitively and somatically, or the drive increases with observers, as opposed to lower skilled individuals who feel a greater anxiety in the presence of spectators. And that area of research is called social facilitation. So the general principles behind social facilitation talk about performance for elite level athletes is best when an easy skill is performed within the presence of an evaluative audience versus a difficult task or a complex skill that is performed with no audience or passive observers. So let's talk about what that means for a second. If you look in your textbook, there on page 39, there is figure 2.3. It talks about the effect of skill, difficulty, and type of audience on performance. So if you notice in that graph, the horizontal plane is talking about the type of audience. So if we look all the way on the left-hand side, there's a highly evaluative audience. Maybe there's scouts that are in the stands. Maybe it's they're performing for their own peers. Maybe the Vikings are playing and the Dallas Cowboys are in the stands watching them. A highly evaluative audience that knows the sport and that can be very critical of the sport. And as you progress down the horizontal line all the way to passive observers, those are types of individuals that may not know as much about the sport and they're simply there for the pure enjoyment of watching it. If you look at the vertical axes, it talks about the different performance levels, and if the athletes are going to perform very low, and that's at the bottom towards the origin of the graph, or the athlete's going to perform very high. So based on the type of audience, it makes sense that as the type of audience changes from evaluative to passive, we have an increased complexity of skill versus a very high performance for evaluative audiences, and that goes down and the skill level drops as passive observers come to watch. So what we get from this graph is that athletes like to perform under a critical eye, and they perform better or are more comfortable being observed by others. In fact, they prefer it. So the three things that the researchers of this social facilitation idea really kind of wanted to harp on were three specific factors: the complexity of the task needing to be performed, the person's skill level, and the type of audience present. And again, the more critical the audience, typically the better the athlete performed. Audience effects on athletes' performance also talk about evaluative potential, and this is the degree to which an athlete perceives and reacts to the makeup of an audience. If the perception hurts the performance, maybe there's heightened anxiety, maybe there's an inappropriate arousal level or poor concentration, that's called evaluation apprehension. So I want you to understand the difference between the evaluative potential versus the evaluation apprehension. So what can athletes and coaches do about feelings of apprehension? How can they get past them in order to have a successful performance? The first thing is that athletes need to focus on their attention on the immediate task, not on the observers, not on the audience, especially if they're performing a complex skill. The second thing that they want to do is to make sure that they've practiced that skill until they've mastered it. So hopefully they're not waiting till they get into the high anxiety state or where there's a really loud audience or a really rowdy audience to make sure that what they've done has been kind of solidified so they feel competent in that particular behavior. While further research in this area is needed, it appears that an audience will help the athlete if the skill is relatively easy, more often than the case with advanced competitors, and the audience provides favorable feedback if the audience is non-evaluative. The next factor that we're going to talk about in relation to affecting sport performance is on the home field advantage. And researchers wanted to know, does the home team win more games than it loses on its home field or court? And the answer is kind of a yes and a no for a couple different reasons. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the research out there generally confirms that a home team will win games more often than they lose when playing in front of home team fans. And various reasons for this talk about a greater audience support, familiar surroundings, being able to sleep in one's bed, not having to travel, and being able to follow their set, well-established routines and rituals. There's a couple studies out there that say that there's actually a disadvantage because they must contend with higher observer expectations, creating pressure on the home team and actually causing a home field disadvantage. So that's what you see here. So the best explanation of home teams who win fewer games than when on the road concerns their athletes' perceptions of high spectator expectations. So these high perceived observer expectations can add considerable pressure to athletes and their self-expectations of performance of success. So we all know that the cheers can quickly turn to boos, and then we've got players that are having to deal with this external support and really lowering player confidence. So generally home field advantage, yes, but a little bit of a no, not really. Next in the PowerPoint, we talk about talent identification. What is it and does it work? So you have 3 slides coming up here talking about talent identification, but I'm going to talk kind of in a roundabout manner, addressing all 3 slides. But basically, let's talk about what is talent identification. It's defined as the planned methodological process for predicting performance over time by obtaining information on the prospect's physiological, and technical abilities. So this is typically a process by which children are encouraged to participate in sports in which they are most likely to succeed based on the results of testing. We have to be very, very careful with talent identification because predicting future talent in sport is very risky. It's not terribly accurate. And we understand that because of the idea of motor capacity. Motor capacity is something that is genetically determined in every individual. So this is basically what we're born with. This is our genetic lottery. Are we born with type 1 fibers or mostly predominantly type 2 fibers? Typically, motor abilities, what we're born with in regards to motor capacity, talk about the enduring traits affected by learning and hereditary. So these have to do with things that we will develop as we grow in age. So hand-eye coordination, reaction time, movement balance, things of those nature. But motor skills refer to a particular act performed in the manner in which it's executed. And as we know, our skills grow and develop as time over well. So talent identification is not to be confused with talent selection and talent development. Talent selection is the ongoing process of identifying athletes that are at various stages of the training program, while talent development implies that the players are provided with some sort of appropriate learning or training or practice conditions to really promote and realize their potential. And if you really want to know more on talent development, there's a lot of new organizations, especially within Major League Soccer, especially with the English Premier League, and I'm talking about soccer because I'm a former UCF women's soccer player, but they've really started to build their professional teams at the very, very bottom with these youth training programs, and so that's a really good example of talent development. If you want to see a really good video on it, feel free to Google or YouTube the Southampton Way. It talks about how their English Premier League soccer team had a couple seasons. They did all right, and then all of a sudden they were doing horrible. They were relegated down to the lower division of play and just basically bottomed out, and it was their kind of epiphany and how they changed their approach in building their Premier League team, and started by talent development and bringing in youth soccer players, some of them as early as 7 and 8 years old. So that's something that would be a good video. It's not required. If you want to see more of it, though, it's out there. It's about a 60-minute video. Very, very interesting. I would encourage you to watch it if you had time this week. Another factor affecting sports performance is a topic your textbook covers about drugs in sports. And this is an example of the desperation of competitive athletes to actually succeed in their sport is to actually use some sort of banned substance. So I want to talk first about a couple definitions for you. Drug. It's defined as any substance that alters the physiological process within the body, usually for medicinal purposes to treat, prevent, or diagnose some sort of disease. Drug use is defined as taking a drug for its intended purpose and in the appropriate amount or frequency or strength and manner. Misuse is talking about taking the substance for a specific purpose, but not in the appropriate amount. Finally, drug abuse consists of deliberate use of a substance for other than its intended purpose in a manner that can damage health or someone's ability to function. When we talk about drugs in sports, they're usually categorized as either performance enhancing or recreational. So performance enhancing, an example would be anabolic steroids. Recreational drug example would be something like cocaine or heroin or marijuana. According to the International Olympic Committee, any act of ingesting banned drugs is considered doping. Doping is considered taking any sort of substance that's foreign to the body with the sole purpose of attaining an artificial or unfair increase in performance for competition. Surprisingly enough, there's lots of things that aren't banned by the International Olympic Committee, such as for mature age athletes, such as alcohol, tobacco products, certain diet regimens, amino acids, caffeine within certain limitations, and certain antidepressants and vitamins. A complete overview of drugs commonly associated with sport performance goes kind of beyond the scope of this chapter, so we're not going to get into everything. But if you do want to know more about performance-enhancing drugs, Anshel, Anshel, his research from 2010 really does a good job of completely going over this type of literature. And feel free to do that, specifically concerning anabolic steroids. But what we are going to move on to now is talking about fears of the injured athlete. So fears of the injured athlete are all different ideas surrounding not being able to actually recover from the injury, possibly going back too early and hurting themselves again. Factors like losing playing time or their status or specifically their income. If they're a professional athlete, they're probably worried about the money that they're able to bring in with their family. Being injured on the sideline makes them feel like an unproductive team member and possibly disappointing their coach, teammates, fans, or their families. So some factors affecting returning to play after an injury talks about the need to win the respect of others. Also about low risk-taking and tentative performance. So they kind of have this reduced performance intensity and effort and have a reduced willingness to take risks. A lot of the times it's contingent on mental readiness to play. And if they're not mentally ready and able to ignore their injury during the contest, it's going to cause a suffering of their performance. Poor concentration and poor readiness. A lot of times what happens with injuries is athletes are so focused on the mechanisms that maybe produced it that they're trying to avoid them again in play, which causes mental fatigue, and then mental fatigue can lead to anxiety, which can lead back to re-injury possibly. Low pain threshold intolerance. Threshold reflects an individual's initial detection of pain, and pain tolerance is the maximum amount of pain the individual can tolerate. So each of us differs biologically, maybe even genetically on both measures, and recovery from an injury often reflects the athlete's detection and tolerance of feelings that will almost certainly influence the level of distraction prior to and during the performance, and then also anticipation of re-injury. So these are some causes to actually poor sport performance immediately post-injury and coming back from an injury. So that changes in attentional focusing, where it talks about going from an external broad mindset to internal narrow. And basically recovery from an injury often redirects the athlete's attentional focus to an internal narrow style, which is the opposite of performing injury-free and pain-free. And that change in attentional style creates a different mindset, and it reduces the speed and accuracy in which the athlete processes information. And that's why you see number 3. And then also just a lack of confidence. Some recovery strategies that coaches, trainers, and sports psychologists can take for athletes that have suffered an injury and that are ready to return have to deal with cognitive strategies. So assisting the athlete in positive self-talk using mental imagery or relaxation training, helping them set goals, whether it's goal setting in rehabilitation or whether it's goal setting for future competitions that are coming up. Surround the athlete with social support groups, and then coach support also. So have the coach there to discuss with them, when do you think it's appropriate to return to practice? When is it appropriate to return to competition? Provide encouragement and give them a sense of relevance in the form of the team. Also, allow athletes a chance to vent their feelings. Be careful not to say, oh, you're all right, no big deal, or to blow it off. Don't deny or minimize athletes' fears or feelings. And also, as a coach, it's really important not to play doctor. Allow the team's physician, the trainer, to make the proper diagnosis and prognosis so that you can move forward in the right manner. Also, be aware of athletes who seem to play through an injury and mask their pain. So, this is kind of referred to as the macho syndrome, where they mask it and they act tough just to make sure that they're going to get their playing time. You want to make sure that you keep an athlete involved in contest preparation and team events. Use mental practice and imaging of sports skills. Also, be aware of the malingering athlete who kind of hangs around the training rehab area, who often kind of feigns injury or pain. Well, that's the end of our PowerPoint. I did want to bring your attention to a couple different topics that was not mentioned in the PowerPoint, but it is highlighted in your book, and I do want you to be aware of it because you are going to be responsible for this information. So if you bear with me in a blank screen, I do want to talk about fear of success versus fear of failure. Fear of failure talks about it's a certain form of performance anxiety, and athletes who feel failure are typically likely to avoid training and preparation, which helps ensure their failure and reinforce their belief system. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of future failure. It's also referred to as the motive to avoid failure, and it was initially defined by Atkinson in 1966 as a disposition to avoid failure and a capacity for experiencing shame or humiliation as a consequence of failure. So sometimes people with fear of failure will think to themselves, if I don't try, I can't fail, and that's kind of the worst possible result from fear of failure. Your textbook does a good job of giving guidelines for coaches and parents to help prevent and reduce fear of failure, and those are listed for you on page 37. Fear of success basically talks about the athlete who feels too much pressure to maintain high standards, and instead of achieving their success and having the best performances, they tend to take a safer, less risky approach. So it originates based on training by Bruce Ogilvie, a clinical psychologist with a specialization in sports psychology, and he proposed 5 syndromes that can explain the source or antecedents of fear of success. So athletes with fear of success may fear social and emotional isolation that accompanies success. Athletes also may feel guilt from self-assertion and competition. They might protect themselves from competition because they fear discovering their true potential. They may feel anxiety about surpassing a previous record established by an admired performer. And some athletes may not prefer to deal with the pressure to constantly match or exceed their previous best performance. So again, fear of failure talks about athletes who fear and will avoid training and preparation, whereas fear of success has athletes that will fear the actual gratification of being successful or being a winning athlete. And that concludes our lecture for Chapter 2. I just want to point out to you some of the key points that are available for you as review for the chapter. They're located on your textbook on page 50. There's several key points that would probably be a really good idea for you to understand and know in preparation for your quiz this week. Also, if you look on page 51, those are some of the questions that you'll be required to answer as a part of your lecture questions on your web work folder for week 1 for this class in Blackboard. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, as always, you feel free to send me an email. And good luck with the work for the rest of your week.